Welcome to the Alcove. I'm Mark Malero. My guest today is David Smick. He's a financial markets expert and consultant based in Washington, D.C., and the founder, editor, and publisher of the acclaimed quarterly, The International Economy. He's the author of the book, The World is Curved, Hidden Dangers to the Global Economy, which he's here to discuss with us today, along with the current global economic crisis. David Smick, welcome.
Great to be here.
It's interesting because you talk early in your book about how Thomas Friedman kind of wrote the seminal book about globalization with The World is Flat. And you said, though, that for financial markets, that the world is actually very much curved. And I'm wondering what you mean by that.
Well, let me say, Tom's a friend of mine, and he is the master. He wrote an extraordinary book, The World is Flat. It describes the revolution in the global supply chain for goods and services. And it's an important historic addition to the discussion. But The World is Curved is kind of like the second installment, because the world that I've been in for the last 25 years is the financial markets. And it dawned on me that in the financial markets, the world is curved because you can't see the dangers looming just over the horizon. And it's also an interconnected world of financial danger in which a small village, for instance, in Norway, can see its entire financial future crash. It has to close daycare centers and schools because their financial managers invested in a financial product called a collateralized debt obligation, offered by Citigroup, an ocean away, that went belly up. And so I looked at that and I thought, the nature of our financial system, because financial markets lack complete transparency, is that the world's curved. All the dangers just over the horizon.
And what is your basic take on the current global economic crisis? The more financial people you talk to, the more different opinions that you get. But what is your specific take on this, and how long and how deep a recession, and even potentially worse, do you think we're in right now?
Well, the last line in my book says, it's hardly certain that we're going to go, or the last paragraph, that we're going into a recession. But talk of a recession, which, a year and a half ago would have seemed absurd, is no longer completely absurd now. And a lot of it comes down to, in my view, political risk. We know financial risk, and that the world is trying to get their arms around the financial risk, which we can talk about. But it's kind of like our policymakers are looking through the rearview mirror and they're saying, oh, we got to put out all those fires. Well, the head of us is the potential for a political fire. And you say, why is that important, for the life of an average person? Well, the danger of a financial crisis, obviously, is that investors move to the sideline. We've seen a mass move by investors to the sideline. The world's problem today is not that there isn't capital. Plenty of capital sitting on the sidelines. $6 trillion in global money market funds alone, idle, sitting there, afraid to be deployed. But the political risk is something bad happens in China. The Chinese do something reckless. They get into a trade war with the Canadians. They fight back. Suddenly we're involved, the Europeans, and then suddenly you get not just those on the sideline now, but you get two or three times as many people suddenly move to the sideline because they say this is just too dangerous. And then you do have a depression situation.
Do you have a specific idea of what you think might have caused this crisis? And if you do, does that if you inverse that, maybe provide some answers for a possible remedy?
Well, it's funny. People ask me all the time, and my answer is a little shocking. I say, ultimately, this all started with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the communist model.
Okay.
Not that certainly that's something we wanted to happen, but when the Berlin Wall fell, by the early 1990s, you began to see emerging market economies that had been non-capitalist, the Chinese, and certainly the Indian economy and the Eastern Europe, they all emerged on the scene, and they wanted to be like us. Right. Yeah. And they were pretty good at being capitalists in one form or another, and they started to accumulate excess savings, and they started to export to the world, and they developed these kind of hybrid forms of a capitalist system. And There were some bumps along the way, and just to refresh your memory in history, the late 90s, the Asian economies in particular, stumbled badly, and the Russian economy. But by really about 10 years ago, these economies said, here's the idea, here's the new model. We will tie our currencies to the dollar in one form or another. So, and then we will set up our economies as large export machines, export platforms, beginning with China, but everyone throughout the world, particularly in emerging markets, wanted to be an exporter. Who did they export to? United States.
Of course.
Because we were a non-saving economy, big consumer economy. People call it, we were the consumer of last resort. So here's what you had. You had the world becoming like us, more productive. They started to, export goods to us and to Europe from all over the developing world. We, of course, then paid for those goods. These economies, including China, led by China, started to build up piles of excess savings. Okay, what do you do with the excess? I mean, in China, quickly they developed, what they call central bank reserves, which is basically just the national pile of money of savings, over $1 trillion. They would then recycle that back to us because we were running big deficits, and so they would buy our treasuries, our treasury bonds, and they would buy European treasuries. And but eventually, we developed kind of a global ocean of excess savings. And it seemed great at the time because there was too much money chasing too few investment opportunities. You remember that was the period when Alan Greenspan, the Fed chairman back then, was a genius.
Right. Yeah.
He could walk on water. Alan Greenspan would raise short-term interest rates, and long-term rates would continue to go down. And it seemed, he himself admits it was a very easy time to be Fed chairman because this global ocean of capital so distorted our financial markets that for a while it made it seem like we had free money. We had riskless risk. And so you could see banks suddenly, they could lend at ridiculously low rates, and people who normally wouldn't afford houses could afford houses. And suddenly you developed a housing bubble, but you developed more than a housing bubble. You have bubbles all over the place. You had a credit card bubble, you have commercial real estate bubble. But there's a whole series of bubbles that we developed, but the housing one is the one that's hit the news. But part of it was just, it was this rush of capital that came in, and it was it made the cost of money so cheap, and it also obscured the dangers, the risk. And so we lived this kind of perfect, existence for a while, particularly from the late 90s on to in the last 10 years in particular. And of course, this model has now had a crash landing.
And so what do you think that would then spell then for a remedy, like in terms of how it did crash then? What do we have to do in the next couple of years to try to right this ship?
Well, we have this problem with the notion in our national psyche that this is all just a mortgage problem. But it turns out that this is a problem of financial architecture. That the great credit crisis of 2007 and onward is more than mortgages. That what happened is that the global in banking community 10 years ago came to Washington and said, particularly the big banks led by Citigroup, and said, look, we have all this capital, this ocean of capital. We have a new way of operating, a new business model. And this business model will say, instead of me as a banker lending to you, and I know who you are, I know your background, we know each other for 30 or 40 years, you pay me back. Or if you're a business, I have all my friends as bankers, we make a syndicated loan to you, we know who you are. The bankers came up with this idea, let's take all of our mortgages, in the case of bank loans, put them on the table and dice and slice them up into little pieces. And it's like we'll build a giant tossed salad. and we'll toss these things together and then sell individual salad bowls around the world. And we call those salad bowls mortgage-backed securities. You hear that name, mortgage-backed securities. What is that? Exactly. Well, they're basically selling individual salad bowls for fees, big fees. The banks got huge fees for selling these salad bowls around the world. And it was a new way of diversifying risk. And so that's how they handled all this salad with this new kind of financial architecture. There was only one problem with this. Every once in a while, there would be a tiny speck of toxic waste underneath a piece of salad, but you didn't know where that piece was. And suddenly, about a year and 3 or 4 months ago, the global investment community said, we're declaring a buyer's strike on salad. We're not buying any more of this salad because you eat that one piece of lettuce and you're dead. So we don't know where the lettuce is, and that's really what happened. You had a crisis of confidence in our financial architecture. This funny paper that kind of backs up, and it's used to measure risk and to deploy capital, is really, it's paper, and this is a crisis of confidence in the paper.
One thing I was curious too is, what about then the role of the shadow banking system and this much used term, these credit default swaps, this idea?
To make matters worse, the banks, I listen to the banks go to Washington, and these bankers and investment bankers, they've managed to present themselves as innocent victims. Oh, we need a bailout because we're these innocent victims. I mean, this was sheer greed. I mean, and irresponsible behavior, because they lost control of any understanding of their balance sheets. I mean, the average person today ought to look at a banker and be furious because they knew better. But on top of, playing this game with paper, they said, there's so much of this ocean of capital, there's so much capital available from this great ocean here, let's leverage. So in other words, everything we'll do, we'll borrow so we can magnify it, sometimes 30 times what we had initially invested. And that then we'll make even more money from this process. We can sell more of these salad bowls around of toxic waste around the world. And so, it was so you ended up with a heavily leveraged system. I mean, Bear Stearns was roughly 34-1. Fannie and Freddie, Fannie Mac and Freddie Mac, the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were 75-1. There was a German bank called Hypo Real Estate Bank, over 100-1. So that's to add insult to injury, they leveraged. Then they did one other thing. They added insurance paper, just a paper insurance scheme that they sold on top of this, of this already existing dubious paper. And the insurance became not just insurance, but it also became an investment vehicle. Again, highly leveraged with no accountability. So it is an incredible fiasco of hubris and greed, and now the rest of the country's paying for it.
So what do you think that we need to do now? I mean, people talk about more regulation, but what you don't hear a lot of people say is, the right regulation. And you just had that G20 conference, people talking about maybe the need for a Bretton Woods too. Is there more of a need for more sort of post-national institutions, or is this a case where people should be managing their economies on a country-by-country basis, and they should do that individually because every country has different needs?
Well, let me tell you, if there were a simple solution to where we go from here, you would have all the big shots in Washington would be laying it out. If you've noticed, they have solutions. They change about every 5 days. It's just one proposal after another because they don't have it. Here's why they don't have the big solution. It's not as simple as just saying, hey, let's regulate the financial markets. There's a huge amount of regulation already in existence. It's very tough to supervise the financial market. Here's why. A regulator is no match for the financial wizardry of these Wall Street guys and their lawyers. I mean, an SEC, senior officer earns about $160,000, $180,000 a year, and secretaries at Goldman Sachs have earned $200,000. So the junior executives make millions. They deploy all kinds of financial wizardry. And if someone is a regulator who is amazingly creative and smart and all this, these He's grabbed for, and pulled into the financial markets. They're no match. Here's, you look at the banking system, not to just beat up on the bankers, but it is appalling what they did. They not only, lost any touch, any understanding of their own balance sheets with all this funny paper. They did one other thing. They decided that they would set up, if you can believe this, independent off-balance sheet vehicles. And they all did it. And they set up these entities in which they had no kind of public connection. They weren't on the boards of directors. Give a good example. Citigroup was kind of a leader in this process. And they set up these independent, off-balance, so they're called SIVs. There are a number of names for them. Okay. But and you say, why would a bank do that? Why would they set up an independent vehicle? Well, the reason is that because they could take the mortgage-backed securities that to go back to that salad that they were shoveling out for fees so quickly, and they would shove that stuff onto the independent vehicles, and the people ran the independent vehicles didn't care about what the risk was, and technically what they did, the independent vehicles used the mortgage-backed securities as collateral, and they sold commercial paper all over the world. So now the rest of the world had a true reason to hate America because we were sending them all of our bad paper. But these independent vehicles were really the first thing when the market discovered, the larger financial market discovered this, that's when the trouble began. And you say, what was the bet? Well, the banks bet that their independent vehicles would, if they defaulted on all this bad paper, it wouldn't affect the parent bank. But of course, the global markets, they knew the connection, and they took both the parent bank and the SIVs. They took the stock of both of them down, right. And that's kind of how we started this fiasco of a credit crisis.
So, if you were advising President Obama, or at least wondering what he might do, let's say in his first 100 days or his first year. First of all, what do you think he might do, and what do you hope that he might do?
Well, I think, economies are not just numbers. If economies were simply a matter, and when I say by numbers, if you could just, cut interest rates, but have a central bank cut interest rates, or you could inject central bank liquidity into the system, and that would automatically make everything better, we'd be better right now, because the Federal Reserve has cut short-term interest rates from 5.25% down to 1%. They're probably going to go to near 0%. They have the equivalent of 12 fire hoses of liquidity. There's no reason to go into the technical means of how they do that, but they have fire hoses shooting into the financial system to try to put this fire out. And you say, why isn't it working? Because ultimately, economies, people respond to emotion. It's passion. It's confidence. I mean, when you define liquidity, your viewers hear the word liquidity all the time. And so what do you say? What is that? Well, when you pare everything away, liquidity is confidence. And that's what we've lost. I mean, so what Obama can do, it's going to be very important, the first 6 months, that if he can restore a sense of confidence, that he has a game plan. Now, I think that you cannot reform the financial system without having global reforms. And they're not going to be easy because, look at all the regulatory departments that we have in Washington. Then we have departments on the state level, and they're all fighting, and we have no centralized regulatory system. Yeah. Well, that's the way it is around the world. So it's not easy to get a consensus, but you have to do that for this reason. The Wall Street is they're masters at arbitraging the differences between each country's regulatory system. And so you got to put an end to that. But, the issue here is, I call it the Willie Sutton approach. And that's what Obama needs he needs to look at this. Bailouts are fine if it's just to keep the, things from going over the cliff. But ultimately, there isn't enough money to bail out the entire system. I believe in the Willie Sutton approach, which is when they asked Willie Sutton, why do you rob banks? He said, because that's where the money is. Well, where's the money today in the financial system? Well, the U.S., Great Britain, running large deficits. There isn't a big amount of money to spend to bail out the system. We can try. There's needs to be Germany, China, and they have the capacity to do major fiscal stimulus, and they ought to be doing that. But the money, as I said earlier, is on the sidelines. You have $20 trillion sitting back, doing nothing. 6 to 7, maybe 8 in money market funds alone. And you say, what would bring that money back? All right, that money is not that impressed with a couple $100 billion bailout or of Wall Street. What it's going to be impressed with is if Barack Obama can define in his first 6 months the future financial doctrine for the world. That doctrine has got to show how we are going to not allow this current situation to develop again, but it also is going to say who's going to decide, how much leverage is useful. I mean, we clearly, we can't trust Wall Street. If you ask Wall Street, they would say there's never enough. Can you have a GS-14 in Washington sitting in a regulatory agency know how much leverage is necessary for a sophisticated economy like the United States economy? Probably not. So you need some mechanism. It's probably a public-private consortium where you arrive at some kind of a sense of a regulatory regime where everybody has skin in the game, so to speak. And that's what we don't have now. We have a system where, Wall Street puts enormous effort to hide risk, and the regulators are always behind a step or two. And I think that if he can define that, here's the system. Here is the, this whole process of dicing and slicing. You say, why would people do that? Well, it's called securitization, and it was horribly abused. On the other hand, most economists today said if you ended securitization today, you'd have a depression. Why? Because emerging markets would collapse. It's one of the major ways. It's a means of handling money. The question is, can we reform that process? Which, for a securitized asset, means if you buy it, can you have now labeling saying, who issued the security, what's inside, and what the penalty is if you lie about and you fudge the stuff. So that if Barack Obama can say, look, can define the parameters of the credit crunch, define, the reforms that are going to go in place that will prevent it from happening, but also say, look, this is how we're going to provide financial oxygen to this national economic body in the future, then a lot of that money on the sidelines will quickly come back in.
And do you think if he does that the world will follow his lead?
Well, I think the world has hated George W. Bush so much. It started with the Iraq thing. There was almost a kind of I travel around, and part of my business is just traveling international capitals, and I'm basically interested in information. I don't need to take, to be a partisan in it, but there's almost a psychotic hatred of Bush globally. So I think, Barack Obama has the advantage of coming in as the fresh guy.
There's that goodwill.
There is a tremendous amount, and I talk to Republican friends of mine in Washington, and they're talking about how dangerous the situation is because Obama has, the expectations are enormous. I mean, almost too high for him. Yeah, it's almost impossible for him to. And they say, well, look, he'll be, it's horrible. 2 years from now, he'll be in deep trouble. I said, look, if Barack Obama is not successful, this is such a crucial moment in the world. We're all in deep trouble.
We're all invested.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who's the next president. This is such a crucial moment, and it's so important that he succeed in this, and that's because this is psychology right now. And if he is a failed president in the next 2 years, then with that money, to go back to that sideline money, is never coming back, and it's not going anywhere else in the world, because as bad as we have it right now, the rest of the world's in deep trouble. And the reason is, and to go back to our original discussion, You know, that model where, you know, the emerging markets would set up, tie to the dollar and set up these export platforms, well, it was a very dangerous model for the rest of the world because it made them dangerously dependent on exporting goods. They didn't have a big consumer economy. So when global demand plummeted, which is what's been happening, I mean, you look at container ships around the world, they're empty.
Yeah, well, they're laying people off in China.
Yeah. Oh, China's in deep trouble.
Yeah.
And so, as you know, the rest of the world is crashing quickly. It's going to be much tougher on them long term because they don't have a consumer movement. They have a very limited, you know, export. They got one engine that was driving the economy, exports, and now that engine's now down to 2 cylinders. So, it's a very, very you know, any reform effort that Barack Obama brings, and international in a global kind of Bretton Woods style,
right,
to me, it has to go back and say, look, is this model sustainable to have the rest of the world, you know, send us their capital so we can run huge imbalances and big budget deficits, but also have us be, you know, the only consumers? And I think it's not a sustainable model.
Maybe my last question for you is, you had talked in the book about the 1870 to 1914 period being a time of great prosperity, a chaotic but very prosperous time for America. Are there any lessons from that period that perhaps some of us have forgotten that might apply to today?
Yeah, if you go back to that period of about 100 years ago, it's uncanny how similar it is today. Big prosperity, you know, the industrialization of world economies led by the U.S., and people becoming rich, a lot of international trade, a lot of international capital flows, and then we hit World War I and it all came to a halt, and within the next decade or so, the world economy unraveled. And you look at that period and you say, you know, despite the prosperity, like today, it had financial panics, you know, panic in 1907, which led to the creation of the Federal Reserve. There was, I believe, a panic in 1893. I mean, there was a series of these panics that are very similar to what we're having right now. And what happened is Britain was then the largest country in the world and had the biggest navy and certainly the most powerful country economically. And it was like Britain lost its confidence to lead. And there was no one else in the world to lead. And suddenly, everything unraveled. You suddenly had countries, you know, there'd be the beginning of trade wars, and then countries would clamp on capital controls, all the things that led to the Great Depression. And goes back to that notion of political risk. And it just was amazing when you look at that period and you realize how much kind of political leadership matters. It seems like it's all just a bunch of politicians giving speeches, but people look to their leaders for, you know, kind of a reflection of credibility, and they say if that leader reflects a credible, you know, a confident outlook, then things must be okay. And the British didn't do that, and America's in a similar position today. I mean, here we are. You know, you can make an analogy to the Iraq War, where we're, you know, in the midst, you know, at the tail end of a war, we've lost confidence. The world's lost confidence in us. And you take a look at China right now, and you say, what are the chances for a trade war? There's already, I can see just today, a big beginnings of a little tiff between the Canadians and the Chinese. You know, the Chinese are, the Chinese have manipulated their currency, kept it from appreciating for the last, you know, 5 years, despite the protests of the world. Now the Chinese economy is in deep trouble. And so what are they doing? They're driving the currency down, you know, which is insane from a global perspective, because you have the country with the biggest surpluses and the biggest, you know, pile of foreign exchange reserves, excess savings, and they want to cheapen their goods globally so they can keep exporting their way out of it. There's no leadership in the world, and yet when I see that, the Chinese behavior, I look and I say, you know, the risks ahead are probably political risks. And that's why I mean, I hate to say it, but the pressure is on Barack Obama, and you can see that to provide the sense of global leadership, it's going to be very tough to do. But that's going to be it's not whether he can get a bailout for some industry and not for some other industry. It's going to be more of his ability to project leadership and to win the confidence internationally, so that you can have an international kind of consensus and to sit down with the Chinese and say, look, we're all in this together. If we get into a big squabble, then we're all going to go down. So.
Very good. Well, thank you very much for being
Yeah,
here.
it's great to be here.
Thank you.
Great.
And thanks for being with us. We'll see you again soon.